History often buries its most corrosive truths beneath layers of silence, sealed documents, and official denials. The Second World War was not only a clash of nations, armies, and ideologies. It was a shadow war, fought in archives, in interrogation chambers, and in the unmarked corridors of power. What the world remembers are the battles, the speeches, the flags raised above ruined cities. What is forgotten, or deliberately erased, are the darker bargains, the betrayals, and the secret operations that shaped the war as much as the tanks rolling across Europe or the bombers blackening the skies. In the classified records of the Reich Security Main Office, in the cipher rooms of the NKVD, in the sealed boxes of MI5 and OSS, lie fragments of these concealed histories. Some appear as faint traces, burnt edges of memoranda, intercepted signals with missing pages, testimonies whispered decades later to tribunals unwilling to listen. Others survive only as shadows, projects denied by governments, operations erased from official communiques, names that vanish from rosters just as suddenly as they appear. They tell of pacts between sworn enemies, of weapons designed not to wound but to annihilate, of convoys laden not with soldiers but with secrets, and of negotiations that betrayed allies while battles still raged. These are not tales of strategy alone, but of the thin moral compromises that reshaped the post-war world. Tonight, we unseal 4 such files, long hidden in dust and silence, each one a revelation of what was never meant to see the light of day. Chapter 1. The Secret Pact of Operation Iron Wolf. The evidence does not come from a single document, but from fragments scattered across 2 collapsed empires. In a Soviet archive once sealed in Smolensk, File K472 contained cross-referenced notes linking NKVD operations to the Reich Security Main Office. The name Operation Iron Wolf appeared only twice, both times in marginalia, circled in pencil beside prisoner transfer lists from 1940. The handwriting is hurried, the ink already fading, yet the implications remain chilling. The year was one of temporary alliance between 2 ideologically opposed giants, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, joined in the shadow of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On maps spread across Berlin and Moscow, new borders were being inked in, redrawn with brutal efficiency. Behind these maps, however, another pact seems to have been forged, one that vanished from official history. Reports indicate that captured resistance fighters, Polish, Lithuanian, and Jewish partisans, were identified as high-value detainees in both German and Soviet records. Survivors from Warsaw spoke of comrades arrested by Gestapo agents in early spring, only to vanish weeks later in Soviet detention camps hundreds of kilometers east. Likewise, Soviet resistance figures apprehended in Vilnius and Grodno were documented as delivered into Gestapo hands. Freight trains were the silent couriers of this collaboration, their wooden boxcars sealed with Reichsadler insignias departing westward, while others under Red Army Guard rattled eastward through Brest-Litovsk. Witnesses described the same pattern. Detainees blindfolded, chained, loaded under armed escort, and never seen again. What awaited them was not trial or prison, but the interrogation cell, the execution pit, or the unmarked grave. Declassified NKVD memoranda reference currency exchanges of prisoners, a phrase cold in its detachment. One note dated 17th June 1940 refers to delivery of 27 Polish nationalist elements to German security, their names never preserved in Soviet registries. In Gestapofile no. 17, discovered after the war in Berlin's ruins. A similar ledger marks arrival of Bolshevik agitators, delivered via Brest. Both lists end abruptly, with no record of where the individuals were transferred. It is as if they were deliberately erased, their existence consumed by bureaucracy that treated human lives as pawns in a clandestine ledger of death. The political climate allowed such exchanges to occur unnoticed. In 1940, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, officially a treaty of non-aggression, but in reality, a cynical blueprint for the partition of Eastern Europe. While propaganda declared ideological enmity, secret police chiefs Heinrich Himmler and Lavrenti Beria shared a common purpose: neutralizing underground resistance. From Berlin to Moscow, partisans were considered more dangerous than regular armies. They could sabotage supply lines, assassinate officials, and stir rebellion in occupied cities. Crushing them required ruthlessness and cooperation across enemy lines. The geography of disappearance centered on the borderlands. Brest-Litovsk, Smolensk, and Vilnius became transfer points where files went missing and prisoners were swallowed by silence. Surviving German station records, stamped with eagle seals, list unmarked trains bound for special security transport. Soviet logs, heavily redacted, mirror these movements with vague entries such as cargo units relocated under Directive 472K. Deciphered by historians decades later, they reveal synchronized operations timed within days of one another, suggesting not coincidence but coordinated design. Those who resisted in Poland, Lithuania, or Ukraine were not only hunted by one oppressor, but by both. Their capture a ticket to a nameless death delivered by whichever regime considered it most expedient. Eyewitness accounts, though rare, confirm the machinery at work. A Polish rail worker, interrogated during a 1962 trial in Warsaw, testified he had seen armed Soviet guards handing chained detainees over to Gestapo officers at the Brest station. He recalled the hush that surrounded the transaction. No official papers signed in public, only whispered exchanges and curt nods. In his words, they were enemies in speeches, but not in the night at Brest. There they worked together, and the prisoners were the price. His testimony was quickly suppressed, the transcript filed under restricted access, deemed dangerous for Cold War narratives that painted the Soviet Union as liberators rather than co-conspirators. The moral consequences of such collaboration are staggering. By exchanging resistance fighters, both regimes ensured the extermination of their fiercest opponents while maintaining plausible deniability. Prisoners disappeared into systems designed to erase them. Their families left without graves, their names stricken from records. For Germany, this meant eliminating underground networks that threatened the Wehrmacht's advance into the east. For the Soviet Union, it meant purging nationalist groups that could challenge Stalin's control of annexed territories. For the victims, it meant annihilation by whichever power claimed them. Fragments of correspondence add further weight. A decrypted NKVD cable from Minsk, dated 12th August 1940, references coordination with German colleagues regarding nationalist transfers. Meanwhile, Gestapo notes recovered from Krakow in 1945 mention delivery completed by Soviet allies, recommend liquidation upon arrival. Though neither side ever publicly admitted such cooperation, the documents align too closely to dismiss. Both agencies were masters of secrecy, yet even masters leave traces when their empires collapse. Those traces, once pieced together, paint a portrait of two sworn enemies momentarily united by a shared obsession, the total erasure of resistance. Historians who have studied Operation Iron Wolf describe it as a conspiracy of silence. Official Soviet histories omit any mention of prisoner exchanges. German post-war interrogations of Gestapo officers yielded evasions, with many claiming ignorance or shifting blame onto colleagues who had vanished in the chaos of 1945. Yet the scattered files tell their own story. Where names should be, there are blanks. Where movements should end in prisons, they end in nothingness. Families searching for decades found only locked doors and destroyed registries, as if the state itself had conspired to obliterate memory. The legacy of these disappearances lingers even now. In villages across Poland and Lithuania, photographs of young men and women hang in homes, faces staring out across decades of unanswered questions. Some were poets, others farmers, others students, each branded as agitators or terrorists by bureaucrats wielding rubber stamps of death. Their erasure was not only physical but historical, leaving descendants to inherit silence where memory should have been. The archives, when opened, whisper only fragments, never the whole truth. Operation Iron Wolf remains less a documented program than a ghostly outline, visible only in the shadows it left behind. The collaboration between Gestapo and NKVD serves as a grim reminder that ideology was often subordinate to expediency. Two powers that would soon hurl millions against each other on the battlefield were, for a brief period, partners in suppression. Their cooperation demonstrates how totalitarian regimes, despite outward differences, share a core belief that opposition must be crushed without mercy, and that the disappearance of individuals is a tool as effective as any weapon. It is a story buried for decades, denied by governments, concealed in censored archives. Yet the faint pencil marks in file K472, the erased names in Gestapo ledgers, and the memories of survivors who dared to speak point inexorably to its truth. In the dim light of history's archives, Operation Iron Wolf stands as a testament to betrayal, silence, and the expendability of human life. The voices of the disappeared remain unheard, but the fragments left behind speak for them. Fragments scattered like ashes across two collapsing empires. And though both regimes crumbled, their silence endures, echoing in the unanswered questions that still linger in the borderlands where trains once carried men and women into oblivion. What began as an unholy pact in 1940 has become today one of the darkest hidden files of the Second World War. Chapter 2: Churchill's Hidden Biological Weapons Program. In the annals of Britain's wartime decision-making, the image of Winston Churchill is often painted in bold strokes. A defiant statesman, cigar clenched between his teeth, voice booming with declarations of resistance. Yet beneath the familiar speeches and celebrated victories lies a darker layer of decisions concealed from the public eye. In July 1942, a memorandum marked Most Secret was circulated within the Cabinet Office under reference 12-432. Its contents, later declassified in fragments, reveal an unnerving directive from Churchill himself: the initiation of biological weapons research with anthrax at its core. The project would be executed under the control of Porton Down, Britain's chemical and biological warfare research establishment, with the remote island of Grenard, off Scotland's northwest coast, chosen as the testing ground. The initiative carried the codename Operation Vegetarian, a plan designed not for defence, but for the systematic devastation of Germany's civilian population and agriculture. Grenard Island, a windswept and uninhabited outcrop, became the stage for experiments of chilling precision. In the summer of 1942, Royal Engineers delivered pens of sheep to its grassy terrain. From modified RAF bombers, anthrax-laden bomblets were dropped, their casings dispersing fine spores that drifted invisibly on the sea breeze. The animals collapsed within days, their lungs blackened, their wool soaked in fluids that carried the disease. Naval observers stationed offshore recorded every detail. Photographs recovered decades later depict grotesque carcasses scattered across the ground, lifeless under grey skies. The tests confirmed what scientists at Porton Down feared and desired. Anthrax was lethal not only in controlled laboratories, but also in the open air. Once released, it clung to soil and vegetation with terrifying persistence. Grenard remained contaminated for decades, sealed off to civilians, its poisoned earth an unspoken monument to an experiment that Britain never officially acknowledged. The broader plan was far more sinister. Operation Vegetarian envisioned the mass production of linseed cakes, each one laced with anthrax spores. The cakes would be dropped by bomber squadrons over German farmland, where they would be consumed by cattle. The livestock would die swiftly, spreading spores into the food chain, contaminating meat and milk supplies across entire regions. The civilian population, dependent on agriculture during the war's shortages, would be struck with epidemic levels of infection. The plan's objective was not merely to weaken the German army, but to bring famine and disease to millions of civilians. Production facilities were prepared in secret, and by 1944, thousands of these poisoned cakes had been manufactured and stored in readiness. Had the invasion of Germany faltered, had D-Day failed, the order might have been given to unleash them. Cabinet papers confirmed Churchill's personal involvement. In one handwritten note, preserved in the archives, he demanded, "We must not allow ourselves to be beaten in this matter by the Hun. We should not hesitate to use bacteriological weapons if it will shorten the war." His words, brisk and devoid of hesitation, reveal the ruthless calculus of wartime leadership. Publicly, Churchill railed against German crimes. Privately, he authorized a program that mirrored the logic of total destruction. In his reasoning, the survival of Britain justified preparations for any measure, however devastating. For those who executed the orders, however, the weight of secrecy was profound. Scientists at Porton Down were bound by oaths of silence, their notebooks marked with top-secret stamps, their results discussed only within secure compounds. Many carried their knowledge into the grave, unwilling or unable to speak of what they had witnessed. The contamination of Grenard became both a symbol and a curse. After the war, local fishermen and farmers pressed the government for information, fearing the spread of disease to nearby communities. Officials denied all danger, insisting the island was secure. Yet internal reports contradicted this. In 1943, several sheep carcasses washed ashore on the mainland, carried by the tides from Grenard. Tests revealed anthrax infection. Military police confiscated the remains, and the incident was classified immediately. The secrecy was so strict that even members of Parliament were kept uninformed. Only a handful of officials in Whitehall knew the full scope of the island's contamination, and their reports were buried in restricted files. For the residents of the Scottish coast, the truth would not emerge until the late 20th century, when the decontamination of Gruinard finally began. The United States was not ignorant of Britain's program. American intelligence operatives stationed in London codenamed it Operation Vegetarian, after intercepting discussions between Porton Down scientists and their American counterparts. The US itself pursued its own biological research at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and the two nations shared select findings under the umbrella of wartime cooperation. Yet while America focused largely on defensive measures, Britain pressed forward with a weapon designed for mass civilian impact. In declassified US cables, American officials expressed unease about the British willingness to cross the threshold into biological warfare. One memo remarked, "The scale and intention surpass any current American planning. Should these measures be employed, the repercussions, political, humanitarian, and moral, would be incalculable." The aftermath of the program's concealment was felt long after the war ended. In 1945, as Germany surrendered, the linseed cakes remained locked in storage. Churchill's defeat in the general election that year coincided with the winding down of Britain's most dangerous secret. The cakes were eventually destroyed, their existence never publicly admitted. Gruinard Island, however, stood as an enduring reminder. For nearly 50 years, signs warned trespassers away. Danger, contaminated, keep off. Soil samples taken in the 1970s still tested positive for anthrax spores, proving the enduring resilience of the weapon. Only in 1986 did the government finally authorize a full-scale decontamination program, spraying the island with formaldehyde and seawater, and by 1990 it was declared safe. Yet even then, the spectre of the tests lingered in the public imagination, a reminder of what had been prepared in silence. The moral dimension of Churchill's program remains one of the least examined aspects of his wartime leadership. While the firebombing of Dresden and the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki have entered global debate, Britain's biological weapons initiative remains comparatively hidden. The absence of deployment does not erase the intent. In the archives, the memoranda, the production orders, and the photographs of dying sheep stand as stark evidence that the Allies were prepared to unleash horrors equal to those they condemned. For many historians, this revelation reshapes the narrative of the Good War, complicating the moral clarity often ascribed to it. Churchill, in his determination to defeat Nazi Germany, authorized a weapon that could have rendered vast stretches of Europe uninhabitable. For the families who lived near Gruinard, the secrecy fostered suspicion and resentment. Generations grew up with an island forbidden to them, shrouded in barbed wire and warning signs. Stories circulated of mysterious illnesses, unexplained livestock deaths, and military patrols guarding an empty rock. Only when investigative journalists in the 1980s pried open the story did the truth become widely known. By then, the island had become a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that even in a democracy, decisions of life and death could be hidden from the people. The files, when finally opened, revealed the depth of that concealment. Operation Vegetarian was not a rumor, it was a blueprint for mass civilian destruction, signed and sanctioned at the highest levels. Churchill's hidden biological weapons program endures as a chapter of wartime history that governments prefer to forget. It reveals the razor-thin boundary between survival and annihilation, between defense and atrocity. The sheep that fell on Gruinard were only the first casualties of a weapon that, had it been unleashed, might have turned Germany into a wasteland and Europe into a continent scarred not only by bombs and bullets, but by disease and famine. The silence that surrounded it for decades speaks louder than any speech made in Parliament. Behind the legend of Churchill, the saviour lies a man who, in desperation and determination, was willing to gamble with the very fabric of humanity itself. Chapter 3. The Ghost Convoys of Operation Hannibal. The end of the war in Europe is often remembered as a time of liberation, of advancing Allied armies and the collapse of Hitler's Reich. But in the frozen waters of the Baltic Sea during the winter and spring of 1945, another story was unfolding, one drowned in silence, fear, and secrecy. Codenamed Operation Hannibal, the evacuation ordered by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz on 23 January 1945 was one of the largest maritime operations in history. Over 2 million civilians, soldiers, and Nazi officials attempted escape from East Prussia, Courland, and Danzig as the Red Army pressed inexorably westward. Yet within this immense movement of people, hidden among the desperate and the dying, were convoys carrying cargoes so secret that their existence was scarcely acknowledged, even within the Reich. These were the ghost convoys, ships burdened not just with human souls but with treasures, documents, and weapons that Germany sought to conceal as its empire collapsed. Among the most infamous of these vessels was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a former luxury liner repurposed for evacuation. On 30th January 1945, it was struck by 3 torpedoes fired from Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Alexander Marinesko. The ship carried over 10,000 people, refugees, wounded soldiers, and naval personnel. In less than an hour, it sank into the icy waters of the Baltic, taking more than 9,000 lives, the greatest maritime disaster in history. Yet testimonies from survivors hint at a darker dimension. Sealed compartments guarded by SS men were said to hold crates of Reichsbank gold, archives of the Sicherheitsdienst, and looted art from Warsaw and Königsberg. Survivors recalled orders forbidding access to certain decks, even as the ship listed fatally. What sank with the Gustloff was not only human life, but evidence that could have illuminated the hidden dealings of the Reich. The General von Steuben, another converted passenger liner, met a similar fate days later. Struck by torpedoes from the same submarine, it carried nearly 5,000, including wounded soldiers evacuated from East Prussia. Once again, survivors reported seeing uniformed guards protecting compartments marked with sealed wax insignias. Rumors circulated that these holds contained chemical agents, part of the Reich's clandestine warfare stockpiles. Declassified Soviet naval reports suggest the NKVD had standing orders to prioritize attacks on these convoys, not merely to inflict military damage, but to prevent secret cargoes from reaching the West. In the frigid night of 9th of February 1945, the sea swallowed both passengers and secrets, leaving only scattered debris on the waves. The logistics of Operation Hannibal were immense. Over 1,000 vessels, freighters, liners, fishing boats, and warships were pressed into service. Harbors at Pillau, Gottenhafen, and Danzig overflowed with terrified civilians, their possessions stuffed into sacks, their eyes fixed on the smoke of Soviet artillery advancing closer each day. Amid the chaos, select lists of ships were prepared by the SS and Abwehr. These lists, later recovered in fragmentary form, bore annotations such as special cargo, archival materials, or simply sealed containers. Their destinations were often Kiel or Lübeck, ports still under German control but vulnerable to Allied air raids. The secrecy surrounding these cargoes was absolute. Ordinary crew members were given no explanations. Guards were handpicked from SS Totenkopf units, men accustomed to silence and brutality. The fate of these ghost convoys was often sealed before departure. Soviet intelligence, through intercepted Enigma decrypts and local informants, tracked the movement of evacuation ships. In Moscow's archives, NKVD file R281 includes a chilling directive: priority target, convoys suspected of carrying enemy state assets. Elimination must be total. This directive explains the ferocity with which Soviet submarines patrolled the Baltic. To the outside world, the sinkings appeared to be acts of war, ruthless but within the logic of conflict. To those within the Soviet command, they were also acts of erasure, ensuring that Nazi treasures, documents, and potential bargaining chips would never fall into Western hands. Among the cargo rumored to have been lost were parts of the famed Amber Room, looted from the Catherine Palace near Leningrad. Witnesses reported crates loaded under SS supervision at Königsberg in late 1944, destined for shipment westward. Whether they sank aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, the Steuben, or another vessel remains uncertain. What is certain is that the Amber Room has never been recovered. Its fragments, if indeed they lay in the frozen Baltic seabed, rest alongside countless victims, locked in silence beneath layers of sand and ice. Naval divers sent by both East German and Soviet authorities in the 1950s reported wrecks too unstable to search fully, their holds inaccessible, their secrets preserved by cold and darkness. The convoys also carried prisoners. Testimonies from Soviet interrogations describe ships containing not only refugees, but also captured forced laborers, chained in holds, their fates sealed by the sinking of their transports. Survivors who reached the west spoke of screams from below deck as torpedoes struck, of guards refusing to release captives even as water rushed in. The deliberate mixing of civilians, soldiers, prisoners, and secret cargo created a tableau of human tragedy and bureaucratic calculation. Lives were expendable. Secrecy was paramount. One ship, the Deutschland, managed to reach Copenhagen carrying crates marked Sicherheitsdienst Archives. These were reportedly destroyed by SS officers in the city before surrendering to Allied forces in May 1945. The destruction ensured that key files, potentially detailing Nazi intelligence networks, foreign collaborators, and hidden assets, never reached Allied tribunals. Yet scattered fragments survived. A file recovered in Lübeck listed payments to informants in Sweden and Switzerland, suggesting neutral nations had been deeply compromised. Had the full archive survived, the political consequences could have been explosive, implicating individuals who later played roles in post-war governments. The magnitude of death in the Baltic during Operation Hannibal is staggering. Beyond the Gustloff and Steuben, dozens of other ships were sunk, including the Goya, which lost over 7,000 lives in April 1945. The official German narrative portrayed these as tragedies of war, emphasizing civilian suffering. The hidden narrative, buried in classified reports, suggests deliberate attempts to mask the loss of incriminating materials. For the survivors, memories were fractured by trauma. Many refused to speak for decades, their testimonies suppressed by shame, fear, or the futility of challenging official history. It was only in the 1980s and 1990s that researchers began piecing together the pattern. The Baltic was not just a graveyard of refugees, but a watery vault where the Reich's darkest secrets were consigned. The visual motif of these ghost convoys endures in survivor accounts. The frozen breath of passengers huddled on deck, the black horizon pierced by the faint glow of artillery, the sea itself an endless expanse of cold indifference. Within the holds, the sealed crates and guarded compartments became symbols of secrecy amid catastrophe. Even as ships went down, guards prioritized the protection or destruction of their cargo. This obsessive secrecy testifies to the value the Reich placed on what they carried. Whether treasure, documents, or weapons, Operation Hannibal is remembered officially as a humanitarian evacuation. Yet beneath that narrative lies its forbidden counterpart. It was an operation of concealment as much as rescue, a desperate attempt to ferry away not only civilians, but the Reich's hidden assets. The sea swallowed much of it, denying victors and victims alike the truth of what was carried. Today, divers occasionally recover fragments, helmets, rusted rifles, children's shoes, but the sealed crates remain buried in silt, untouched. The Baltic guards its secrets, as silent and implacable as the regimes that once ruled its shores. In those frozen waters, history lingers unresolved, a reminder that not all of the Reich's collapse was recorded on land. Some of it lies beneath the waves, unseen, unspoken, and unfinished. Chapter 4. The Betrayal within Operation Sunrise. In the final winter of the Second World War, while the world's attention was fixed on collapsing front lines and advancing armies, a different kind of battle was unfolding in the villas of neutral Switzerland. It was not fought with tanks or bombers, but with whispered promises, coded telegrams, and secret handshakes. Codenamed Operation Sunrise, these negotiations began in February 1945 between representatives of the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and SS General Karl Wolff, Himmler's trusted adjutant and the higher SS and police leader of Italy. The talks were conducted under a veil of secrecy so profound that even senior Allied leaders were kept unaware, and the very existence of the operation would be denied for decades. Yet in the shadows of Swiss neutrality, the future of post-war Europe was being bargained long before the final guns fell silent. Wolff, facing the inevitability of German defeat, sought to preserve his own life and reputation by offering the early surrender of German forces in northern Italy. He arrived in Switzerland under false papers, traveling through the Alps with escorts arranged by intermediaries tied to the Vatican. At the negotiating table in Lucerne and later in Zurich, he met with Alan Dulles, head of the OSS station in Bern. Declassified CIA transcripts reveal Wolff's proposal in stark terms. If granted protection from prosecution, He would convince Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's forces to lay down arms, sparing northern Italy from devastation. These talks were not authorized by all the Allies. The British SIS protested bitterly when word leaked of the Americans' independent maneuvering, while the Soviets, kept in the dark entirely, would later accuse Washington of conspiring to betray the Allied pact of unconditional surrender. The transcripts of these meetings, preserved in fragments in the CIA's Crest archive, describe Wolf as confident, even arrogant, despite representing a regime collapsing in flames. He spoke of his personal influence over SS officers in Italy, of his ability to deliver surrender without involving Hitler, who still ranted in his Berlin bunker. Dulles, cautious yet intrigued, reported back to Washington that the opportunity could not be ignored. President Roosevelt's administration hesitated, fearing both Soviet reaction and accusations of collusion with the enemy. Yet the talks continued, shielded by layers of plausible deniability. Messages were transmitted through couriers, written in neutral phrasing such as arrangements for agricultural cooperation, disguising their true purpose from prying eyes. The secrecy was pierced when Soviet intelligence intercepted fragments of these communications. NKVD reports sent to Stalin in March 1945 warned of separate discussions between the Western Allies and German SS officers. To Stalin, already paranoid about Western intentions, this confirmed his deepest suspicions that Britain and America were preparing a separate peace, leaving the Soviet Union to bleed on the Eastern Front while securing their own post-war advantages. Furious, he dispatched cables demanding explanations, but the American responses were evasive, assuring him that no betrayal was taking place. The damage, however, was done. Operation Sunrise sowed seeds of mistrust that would grow into the frost of the Cold War. For the men on the Italian front, the consequences of these secret talks were bitter. Soldiers of the US Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army continued to fight and die in the Apennines, while their leaders bargained in Swiss parlors. Resistance fighters of the Italian partisans, who had shed blood in the mountains and valleys, were excluded entirely from the negotiations. When surrender finally came in late April, many suspected that deals had already been struck weeks earlier, deals that protected certain Nazi officials while ignoring the sacrifices of those who had resisted fascism since 1943. Wolf himself was shielded from immediate prosecution. Though arrested, he escaped execution at Nuremberg and later resurfaced as a witness in post-war trials, his testimony carefully crafted to portray himself as a man of peace, rather than Himmler's accomplice. British anger at being sidelined is recorded in SIS memoranda now held at Q. One note from March 1945 describes American recklessness in negotiating with war criminals and warns that such actions threaten the unity of the Grand Alliance. Yet the Americans pressed forward, believing that securing surrender in Italy could prevent the region from falling under communist influence after the war. For them, the negotiations were not just about ending battles, but about shaping the geopolitical chessboard that was already emerging from the rubble of Europe. The shadow of the Soviet Union loomed large in every calculation. The moral ambiguity of Operation Sunrise remains striking. On one hand, the early surrender in Italy arguably saved lives by shortening the campaign and preventing the destruction of cities like Milan and Turin. On the other, it demonstrated how pragmatism could override justice. High-ranking Nazis bartered with the Allies, trading capitulation for leniency, while ordinary soldiers and civilians bore the brunt of continued combat. The secrecy itself was corrosive. By hiding the talks from both the Soviets and many within their own governments, the Americans introduced fissures that would widen in the years ahead. Stalin never forgot, nor forgave, what he perceived as betrayal. The atmospherics of the negotiations are preserved in the surviving testimonies of participants. Rooms lit dimly by oil lamps, maps spread across tables, Wolf in immaculate SS uniform beside Dulles in civilian attire, their words recorded only in fragments. Outside, the snow fell on quiet Swiss streets, muffling the sounds of a war raging only a few hundred miles away. Neutral Switzerland became the stage for duplicity, its air of calm concealing the storm of betrayal beneath. Vatican intermediaries moved quietly between the villas, carrying messages, arranging safe passages, and ensuring the talks remained hidden from prying eyes. Each signature, each nod of agreement, moved the war closer to its end, while simultaneously planting the seeds of the next conflict. When surrender in Italy was officially announced on 2nd May 1945, The public story was one of military inevitability. The hidden story is that months of bargaining had paved the way, ensuring that certain individuals would survive the reckoning. Karl Wolff, despite his role in deportations and mass killings, avoided the fate of his peers at Nuremberg. Instead, he lived until 1984, occasionally surfacing in interviews, his words dripping with self-justification. He claimed to have saved Italy from destruction, ignoring the countless crimes committed under his authority. His survival was not an accident but the direct consequence of Operation Sunrise, of bargains struck in secret villas while soldiers continued to fall on distant hillsides. The betrayal within Operation Sunrise is not only a tale of clandestine diplomacy but a window into the nature of power at the twilight of war. Alliances were fragile, motives conflicted, and the lines between justice and expediency blurred into shadow. The OSS saw in Wolff an asset for the coming struggle against the Soviets. The Soviets saw in the Americans secrecy proof of treachery. The British saw a partner acting unilaterally, and the partisans, who had fought longest and bled deepest, saw only that they were excluded, their sacrifices bartered away in rooms where their voices were never heard. The war in Italy ended not solely on the battlefield, but in whispered deals that foreshadowed the duplicities of the Cold War. The hidden transcripts of Operation Sunrise, sealed for decades, reveal a betrayal not of military necessity, but of trust. A betrayal that reshaped the post-war world in ways few understood at the time. History does not end with victory parades or the signing of surrender documents. It lingers in the sealed files, the missing archives, and the testimonies that never reach the witness stand. The revelations of Operation Iron Wolf, the biological weapons program of Gruinard Island, the ghost convoys of the Baltic, and the clandestine bargains of Operation Sunrise form not just hidden chapters of the Second World War, but foundations of the uneasy world that followed. They show us that war is never fought solely with tanks and rifles, but also with silence, deception, and moral compromise. When governments declare their innocence, archives whisper otherwise. When leaders speak of honor, their secret memoranda betray the calculations of survival. The unanswered questions remain. How many more files lie buried? How many pacts remain unacknowledged? How many voices were silenced before they could speak? In the dim corridors of intelligence agencies, in the rusted wrecks beneath the Baltic, and in the soil of an island once poisoned with anthrax, history waits for those willing to listen. These truths, long suppressed, remind us that the war never truly ended. It merely changed form, carried forward into the rivalries and betrayals of the Cold War and beyond. What was hidden then continues to cast its shadow now, urging us to look closer, to question deeper, and to understand that the cost of silence is often greater than the cost of war itself.